Good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of Well Said. Our guest today is Ken Pope. Ken is the director of academic programs at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He has a 34-year career in the U.S. Army, where he was a special operations and Russian Foreign Area Officer, or FAO, assigned to Europe, Middle East, and Central America as well, and had over 12 years of operational field work in an Army FAO, with a focus on Russia and the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and security issues, with a variety of assignments in Russia, Ukraine, Estonia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Kosovo. Now, I bring up all your travels and your living assignment background because I feel it's particularly relevant to today's topic. We have a tendency to remember terrible times in human history, while also forgetting why they were so terrible. When we remember, or when we speak about the evils of communism, it's not often that we'll delve into the many examples of what it was like to live under a communist regime. The fact that no one could congregate, for example, in basic social settings without being labeled as a conspirator. I think, moments like that, you're kind of like, wow, how could that actually overlay with today's society? And you start to think about it a little bit more. So I think these examples are really vital to, the argument against communism in today's society. I was looking through, Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation's website, and I saw some quotes by like Sir Roger Scruton. And one of the ones that stood out the most is when he talked about how it became apparent that the real evil of communism, apart from the cruel treatment of individuals, lay in the systematic destruction of civil society. And I think we can look around today and see a disconcerting lack of civil society, where attempts to debate, gather in protest, or go against the mainstream way of thinking is met with hostility, violence, and censorship. The surveillance state and policies encouraging neighbors to inform on one another that were popular in communist and totalitarian regimes didn't completely go away, in my opinion. They've just kind of migrated west, it seems. So I would like to start by asking you, Ken, why does it seem so common that societies go down these paths? Is it something that is drawn out by complacency, like liberty, is something that we have to always strive for? So when we become a complacent society, do we just kind of fall back into these bad habits? Why do societies consistently find themselves in these situations?
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's really a privilege to speak with you and speak with your audience as well. This is such a fascinating topic. I think what happens is it's a slow process, right? It starts at the incremental level, where a group that's more, let's say, Marxist in nature, or communistic in nature, or has those leanings or beliefs, they start by tossing out some different ways of describing things. Talk about the language. Language becomes confused. And, typically a lot of folks don't initially see it as dangerous or worrisome until it gets farther down the road, where you're already involved in it before you know what's happened. So I think that's how I think it is complacency. I think that we're all busy leading our lives. But you have to understand too, that some of these groups have an agenda. Obviously, they want to get things to turn the way, let's say, if it's a Marxist group or what have you, that are more interested in a controlling type environment. They want their language to be the one accepted, and anybody who doesn't agree with either their policies, their doctrine, or ideology, they become an enemy. They become a target, and it's a much easier to start condemning them, because they are the enemy at that point.
Right. Yeah. So let's dive in a little bit more with the real experiences of what you kind of saw on the ground. Whether it be East Germany or other areas. I'm just curious, like specifically the Soviet regime, but feel free to talk about any other areas as well. I know you were in South America, and they always had issues as well with communism and some of their regimes. Yeah.
Well, let's start with one of my favorite cases, because the first one I experienced live and in person was East Germany. So I went to university, and even back in the 80s when I went through, you still had folks who talked about the Soviet Union and communism as it's not that bad. They're just not doing as well as they could. There's a lot of good aspects to this system and the society. So you get that. My undergrad degree was in sociology of the Soviet Union. So I'm always kind of fascinated with this topic. And then was also in ROTC. I joined the military. My first tour was over on the East-West German border. I arrived there in '86. And what most people don't realize is a lot of people tend to think that the term the Iron Curtain was just a metaphor, but in reality, it was a physical barrier. And the first thing is, this brand new lieutenant goes over to Europe, and you see this fence, and you're thinking, my college professors were telling me, what a great system this is. It's just not, quite perfected yet. If it's so great, why are they keeping, roughly 300 million people behind a fence? What does it really have to offer? why is this great system, a fence designed not to keep me out from coming over? There's nothing I really want there, but to keep the people who maybe desire something else, something a little unique in that part of the world called freedom, to try to get out and escape. And that was how that went for the duration of the Cold War, people trying to get out of that country, out of that system, because it was so terrible. It was all encompassing. It was everything. It took over every aspect of their lives, from what they, it permeated everything. You think about the things that we do today. It was at sports events. It was in the schools. It was in civil society. The only groups you could really have had to be communists or influenced by the communists. Trying to get a new group approved, say like you want to try something like Boy Scouts, well, that was completely forbidden. You couldn't have that. You could be in a communist youth group. And then if it was the way you thought too, you had to parrot the party line. Talk about the cancel culture we have today. Back then, it was a little more of a serious event, right? So if you didn't spout the party line, then, or say the slogans that everybody said, or put the posters up in your shop if you're a small business owner working in a government facility or what have you, that sung the praises of the Communist Party, then there was something wrong with you. Okay, you weren't part of the system, and as such, you were vulnerable now, right? So you didn't believe this, but you felt compelled. You had to say it. You had to talk about and sing the virtues of that system. And if you didn't, there was plenty of people who were willing to report on you. So the East German system, I wrote down a couple of figures for us so we could talk about it, because it's just so amazing. So if you think about East Germany at the time when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, a country of 16 million people, roughly, maybe a little bit less, they had one full-time security or intelligence officer, secret police officer for every 180 citizens in the country. Think about that.
Wow.
Full-time security officers in that country was 91,000. And they had a series of informers of 173,000. If you compare that to what does that look like? We're a nation of 330 million people, right?
Right.
And we have a Marine Corps of roughly 180,000 people. So that's the scale of what their system was for such a very small group of population.
And I would love to see like those numbers compared to other institutions, like compared to educators or medical personnel, just because it's very, very offset on the security side. That is the primary goal, is to protect the power of the government at that point.
And that's a great point. That's a good segue too, is so the communist systems were, they stayed in power by virtue of the security state. They had all control over, lethal force, military power, and what have you. Their system, unlike the Western systems of the U.S., our U.S. security systems, say the military or our intelligence services, by law, they can't focus internally on the American people, right? Mm-hmm. They are dedicated to protecting the people and the sanctity of the nation. That's not true in the communist states. The communist state, the intelligence service, security service, their sole role is protecting the party and keeping the rulers and the regime in power. That's the difference.
Right. No, absolutely. And so let's talk about that a little bit more, of like, why is this power preservation so important? Because the government essentially, it treated everything as if this is a zero-sum game. If the people have any power, then that's the power that the government doesn't have, right? So it's just it was looked at as a trade-off. And so why was it so important, or in totalitarian regimes in general, why is that the ultimate goal? Because it does hark back a little bit to kind of what I'm seeing around here, where it's like this constant strive in our politics to get your party to be the one with the most power. And that's kind of like the drive behind everything. And what path does that lead us down when that's our only goal?
Right. So in these totalitarian or communist regimes, so the ultimate goal of that system is to remain in power. Mm-hmm. They have an ideology that's all encompassing, right? It looks at everything, the social, the political, the philosophical, what you believe internal to yourself. And it's perfect. In their eyes, it's an emergence of this perfect justice system, perfect political order. So if there's anybody who disagrees with that, there must be something wrong with them. But the problem is once they're in charge, the only way they can really maintain power and control is through the use of two major tools in two broad categories. And the tools are violence or the threat of violence, and information control. Right. So they establish this system of control, and they're not going to give it up. And once everything starts falling apart because these guys really don't know how to run a government or make this system called communism, this economic model, of communism and socialism really work for everybody. It's supposed to make everybody, bring everybody up and make everybody, have a lot of resources and everybody's is enjoying wealth. But instead, what it does is nobody owns anything or has anything, and everybody becomes equally poor and needing things. You think about all the lines you see in the videos of the communist period in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe or what have you. There's always a line waiting for something, because the system simply can't do it. So they have to use these tools now to keep the people in check because they want away from the system. But they can't because the monopoly of power is at the government level. And throughout history, the communist regimes have shown a very, very keen willingness to use it to stay in power, regardless of the human cost.
Yeah, and I'm seeing a lot today, especially with the younger generations, talking about communism as if we just haven't tried the right version of communism in human society yet, and that there's still a path for communism that, as you mentioned, will have like these economic benefits, will raise everyone up to equal levels of wealth, but that we could actually avoid the evil side of communism somehow. What are your thoughts on that? Because I hear it all the time, and to me, it just like, that's obviously something that I would never be on board with, because it's not just an economic question, right? At the end of the day, there's more to it.
Yeah, it's an all-encompassing question. So let's take that apart a little bit. So in my view, it's ignorance of history and a true understanding of history. So if you look at where this thing started, so 1917, you have the Soviets try it, and it becomes an abysmal failure. The country implodes. You have all the Eastern European nations after World War II, they are forced to take it on, and none of it really works. You still have these systems that it's just deprivation, repression. It goes to Asia. You got China, you got North Korea, you got, Cambodia, Laos, all those countries, Vietnam that experimented with it, and it never really worked. So I guess I would always go back to the students or the people who say that is, well, tell me where it worked. Right. And if it's not working well, what would you change to do this? Because the violence really starts as immediately, because Marx said, in his manifesto, that the way we're going to achieve this is through revolution and violence. And that's typically been the norm, of how these things take over. There's always some big upheaval. There's a lot of bloodshed. Lenin, everybody seems to think he was the good communist, because I think most people don't realize he killed 7 million people during the Civil War. Yeah, huge number. Stalin killed, millions more. And then the champion murderer was of course Mao, who, the different programs he tried to do and forced on his people, the Great Leap Forward, anywhere between 30 and 45 million people dead. Mm-hmm. The Cultural Revolution, where he spent, a few years there killing off anywhere from 1 to 3 million of his political enemies or foes or people who might threaten his regime. So these things take hold, but there's never any of this stuff where everybody's living together, everybody's enjoying the fruits of the communist, paradise, so to speak. It always goes, what you always get, you definitely get the violence, mm-hmm. but you never really get any of the other great benefits it's this theory supposed to bring along.
Yeah, and the violence isn't just out of resistance, because I think a lot of people misinterpret where the violence in these regimes came from, and that they were just trying to tamp down on resistance and threat to their power. But in addition to that, in order for it to work, like you said, it's part of the philosophy is that this has to be born out of bloodshed, has to be born out of violence. It's something that has to be taken from people, not something that is just kind of, when we think of like liberty and the founding of the United States, we had to take something back for us. But this is something else where you would actually have to take something from people that they own, tear it away from them in order to provide it to the rest of the society. So this is, I think there is no way that this could be born peacefully.
Right. Well, and I think the other thing too is and you kind of hit on it there, is taking things away. So they take literally everything. They take as part of Marx's theory, where it becomes the ideology between Marx and Lenin and the groups, is they have this piece where the abolition of private property, right? So your first piece of property that you really own is your own body, is yourself, right? Right. They didn't view it that way. They viewed people as simply material in this motion of changing history. And what you would get is, if that's how people are viewed, you just become a part of the machine, of the communist machine, or the regime trying to, do whatever they want to do. Right. So as just a repair part, you really have no rights. There's no individual rights. There's no civil rights. There's no God-given rights or natural rights as we espouse in our founding documents. So you are simply a piece that can be used and abused. And when you break or you die, you're gotten rid of. Or if you become faulty, you're going to be replaced, and either replaced and sent to a gulag in the Soviet system or executed, or same thing in China. If you're starting to squeak as a faulty part, then you're going to be removed, and you're going to be put in a concentration camp or some other place or a prison, and you're not going to enjoy the modicum of a little bit of freedom you may have had in these terrible societies.
Yeah, let's talk about, you bring up China. I want to talk about how what we're seeing with contemporary forms of communism that we have in the CCP, for example, in China, versus what we saw with the USSR and Mao. What are some of the major differences? Because I think another reason why there's a misinterpretation, misunderstanding of, communist societies, and that there could be some positive version of it, is because of what we're seeing right now in China, where it actually looks like they are raising their society up pretty quickly compared to most in history with regards to like industrialization and everything. So I think, that positive gain is starting to cloud what our understanding of communism is. So I'd be curious what kind of contemporary communism versus kind of historical examples.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take the communism, the Soviet Union, and when Mao started coming in, he started in the 1920s with the communists trying to fight to take over. Got a great civil war. Eventually, he came in to be the ruler in 48. So, in Mao's view, Stalin wasn't communist enough. So he thought he was the guy. Think about what a butcher Stalin really turned out to be.
Right.
So I think during the 50s, the geopolitical thing, the 60s, the 70s, especially, where, you got the Soviet Union and you got communist China. And, I think in the US, we decided to look at these organizations or these countries a little bit differently. And I think toward, the 70s and then up through the 80s and 90s, we started thinking, well, maybe we can turn China to our way of thinking if we invite them into all these economic groups,
Right.
G7, G8, or, WTO, letting them in the club, so to speak, and thinking that if we let them in the club, they'll see the great fruits of the economic society that we have in our country, and they'll want to become like us. That really didn't play out too well. So what they did is they took all the technology, they stole stuff. It's like the theft of our intellectual property rights. There's the way they crush civil rights and the like. So instead of becoming like us, they've basically taken from us, pretty much, hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars of intellectual property, made their military very ascendant now, where it's a very powerful organization, becoming, a near peer competitor with the US. So this idea of, expecting communism to kind of go away. So now they're at a point where they have, the resources economically, the technology for military use, cyber. I mean, they are a police state enabled by significant technological advancements that makes the security state pretty frightening. I can imagine that if, Stalin and Lenin would have only dared dream of the amount of control that they have in China these days, with the amount of information control they have over their society and the heavy hand they use. So it didn't work out. This great experiment of trying to bring China around to our way of thinking. So they are a somewhat wealthy country because they've stolen so much of it. And they're taking South China Sea, they're taking that away from countries that border that area. They take our stuff. The Belt and Road Initiative, where they're out basically using usury tactics against all these developing countries to get what they want around the world. It's all about taking control, both to be an economic superpower and a military superpower.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about the tactics of how these types of regimes gain their power. One of the ones that we're seeing kind of seep into society today, which is this emphasis on changing and controlling language and words, and then tying words to action as if it's like whatever you say is just as bad as if you like physically did something, because, and it's just treating it that same way just because that's how it's seen as the controlling state, that just an idea or voicing the wrong words would actually, of dissent, would actually put you in the same situation as someone who like actually went and like committed violence against someone. So I'm kind of curious. So on, some of the examples are compelled speech, and obviously, like I said, words are violence. So what is this emphasis on language? Why is this so important to regimes that want to gain this leverage and power over society?
Right. So remember, we talked about those two tools, those two buckets of tools we have. So you got the violence aspect of it. So once you've used violence and really, push people into submission especially in the Soviet era, going up through in China when they're first taking over, and then they really control the information. So the only information that people get is what they received. So it's part of the tool set. Then what happens is, like we talked about a little bit earlier, is that you're now, the system has, the communists, the totalitarians have total control over all information, and they're going to compel compliance. So again, you got to start talking the party line. And if you raise your voice because you don't agree with the system, the dissidents that we had in the Soviet era in Eastern Europe as well, like Havel and the others, Solzhenitsyn and some other examples that we have, what happened to these people? They're arrested. It got farther away from the Stalin area. They weren't executed right away or anything like that, but they were definitely put in gulags. They were put in prisons. They were under house arrest. They lost their jobs. If you were an author or a writer, you weren't allowed to publish. So they controlled all the information, and your information that you gave or spit out had to be approved by the censors, by the communists. I think what we have now is we have the similar thing without the violence, right? So we have people now that, whether you agree with it or not, people are self-censoring. They're afraid to say things because they're afraid they'll be canceled or doxxed, or they won't be able to keep their job. People have been fired by what they said. Back in an earlier era, that would have been called free speech. You might have disagreed with it violently, but you didn't go out to seek, their ruin, which is what we're seeing a lot today.
Yeah, and also like examples of compelling certain like language that, just this use of words to describe things. I mean, actually, a really good example is, I've brought this up before many times, just Colorado State University just put, for example, posters all over their campus saying, if you've recently been affected by a free speech event, here are some, or, if you've been affected or someone that has been affected by a free speech event, here are a list of resources, and it lists, equal opportunity offices, DEI offices, Dean of Students, et cetera. But they're not even calling it hate speech anymore. They're calling it free speech, and they're trying to put this negative spin on free speech as if to, in our minds, convince us over time. The more you hear it, it's all of a sudden free speech is no longer something that people want. I think that's what the goal is. And so kind of curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think it's really, you've seen some, examples even in the media, some recent ones. Let's take this Joe Rogan thing. I mean, I'll be honest with you up front. I don't watch his podcast. I don't know a ton about it, other than, he said some things about vaccination, his treatment regime and all that. And it created a firestorm where people, the funny thing was, the people of the 60s who were considered the rebels, the rebellious generation, all about free speech, wanted free speech, the Neil Youngs, Joni Mitchell, et cetera, the news story, were all about that. And now it's completely flipped on its head. Same thing, Howard Stern. The guy, talking about a guy who pushed all boundaries of free speech to literally to the outer limits, is now, calling for all these people who don't have his particular view of vaccination status or vaccines or treatment to be canceled. Who would have thought, listen to that guy, many, many years ago, that you would ever hear him say something like that.
Oh, as a kid, I wasn't even allowed to listen to him because my mom just was so against some of the stuff he talked about. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think he even was just quoted recently saying something like, I am all for free speech. I'm like the front runner advocate for free speech, except in this situation. And I'm like, well, you're either for free speech or you're not. There can't really be exceptions to that, because once you start to create exceptions, you've opened that door where now all of a sudden, you can kind of put anything on that list that you think is necessary based on your own subjective views.
Right. I mean, just in this compelling speech or making people do things that, you don't necessarily want to do. I remember watching, like we talked about earlier, how the propaganda went into all aspects of society. There was not a single place you could go in that world, in the Soviet era, in Europe or whatever, that you could avoid the posters, the propaganda. And you think about even some of the things that we went through with the kneeling protest in the NFL, where players were, they probably didn't want to do that. There's one example where a guy that played, I think it was for the Pittsburgh Steelers, who was an Army Ranger, served in Afghanistan, but refused to do the kneeling during the national anthem, because that to him was this a bridge he couldn't cross, as a soldier.
Yeah.
But he perceived, think about the pressure and from his teammates and others saying he was wrong and all this. I mean, it was just, it's that level of censorship or trying to compel a speech that is very reminiscent of what these regimes did, all throughout the Cold War and what's still going on in China. We just haven't gotten to that level yet. Hopefully we don't, because that would pretty much be the end of what we call, our freedoms. If you can't say what you really believe, and you feel like you have to self-censor or parrot the party line, that's not a lot different than what we fought against throughout the entire Cold War.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point that, we're not to that level yet where violence is being used, against you, or that the state is not enacting violence on you for some of these things, but you see examples of it getting really close to that line, especially when people's livelihoods are destroyed, or they're kicked off of, there's a really great example of Virginia Tech. I think as a female soccer player, she didn't want to take a knee for the national anthem, but she was on a scholarship for her soccer playing, and she was peer pressured significantly to be essentially like step off the team because she didn't want to take a knee. And so even though the school itself didn't kick her off, just like her peers, the coaches, and everyone else around her was basically saying, you don't belong here, to the point where she ended up losing the scholarship. And so you start to wonder, like, when are we going to actually get to that point? Because it does seem to be getting progressively worse. There's and there are other countries where it has, that are supposedly Western, ideal countries, and that you've seen examples of them. I think Jordan Peterson is an example up in Canada. It wasn't like a little while ago, he didn't want to use pronouns, which would have been a compelled form of speech. And they actually he went to jail for it. So that is right up to the line of what we see in communist and totalitarian regimes, is you're being imprisoned at that point, just like you mentioned. And I one thing I do try to often emphasize to students is we're one of the only countries, even in Western society, that has no exceptions written in our Constitution to free speech. Again, to like reemphasize, every other country has some exception one way or another written into their constitutions when they talk about free speech. And that's something that's so unique about American culture. And again, like our stance against these type of totalitarian regimes.
Yeah.
So feel free to respond.
Yeah, I was just going to think, I think that's a great point. And, I still have a lot of friends who live in Eastern Europe who grew up or who lived during the communist era. And I got an email from a friend, probably a couple months back he lived in Eastern Europe, grew up under the Soviet regime. And he said, I'm looking at the news in your country and it terrifies me. He goes, you people are our last hope, the world's last hope. And if you allow this to take root like we did in our countries, then our hope is gone. And that's from somebody who endured that worries him that much, where he would, at 2:30 in the morning his time, I guess, was watching some stuff and sent me that note. So just it's just something we really need to be very cognizant of. And I think it's just, we got to get to the point now where we don't need to have the tactics of people who are, trying to compel speech or canceling you, but we should definitely take a stand against anytime we see it happening. Because it's just, it's something that George Orwell said, is that there's like this double speak or double speak, where you really don't believe any of the garbage that you're saying, but you feel compelled to use it. So we got to get out of that mode of feeling compelled to use it, and just because this is where it leads. I mean, my role is in this program is I'm looking at this, we're writing a new curriculum. So I'm getting a refresher course and all the stuff that I studied, when I was in college and grad school and the like. But it's not good. It's not a good situation, and we need to quash it while we can before we lose freedoms, because that's eventually where this goes. We're losing slowly our freedom of speech.
Yeah.
From the bottom up. I think social media is a big culprit in this, where it's this mob, probably small group of people who are just, blasting stuff out for anything they don't agree with. They would never do that face to face, because they're, they probably get, crushed, but they feel safe doing it and creating a mob on the internet to go after people.
Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit about that, just talking about different tactics and stuff, and how this happens and how we restrict speech and censor one another. with today's like modern technology, what is this battle with free expression and free speech with big tech companies? I mean, this is a topic that has come up on this podcast a number of times. But just in general, in the world of free speech, it's something like you mentioned with social media, TikTok, and all of these apps that are out there, with younger generations being very specific as to who they choose based on their value systems, and what pressure that puts on tech companies to espouse these certain, whether it be like progressive woke ideas that still shut down free speech. Like, how does this all work? What are your thoughts on all of that?
Well, I think I think they're reacting to, I think, a lot of the things they're seeing, and I think they're reacting in the wrong way. I think what they're doing is they're saying, well, I'm going to limit the speech that I don't agree with, or that, I'll just call it what it is in a lot of cases, a small mob of people who just, or scream the loudest and make the most noise, and they're playing to that. And I think also there's a political component too. I think, they typically lean more to the left, and I think they support those causes that go that way, and they're seem like they're pretty quick on the trigger to quash a lot of speech that they don't agree with, but not so much to some of the things that you hear from the more the left leaning side of the political spectrum. So I think that's dangerous, and I think it's just. And again, it's not even so much what people say. I think it's just where their political leanings lie and how they identify themselves is what makes them a target. And there's one quote I wanted to share with you on that topic about, we really don't even look for what people that have done anything wrong. We just don't agree with what they've said. So like you said earlier, so this great quote from this guy from one of the security organs of the Soviet Union, the Czech at the time, back in 1918, a guy named Martin Latsis. And he had this quote about how to deal with people. So let me read what he said about it. He said, "We are not fighting against single individuals. We are exterminating the bourgeois as a class." So this is his key point. Do not look in materials you have gathered for evidence that a suspect acted or spoke against the Soviet authorities. First question you should ask him is, what class does he belong to? What's his origin, his education, his profession? These questions alone should determine his fate.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that is exactly kind of like what we do when we're thinking how we categorize one another these days through this identity politics conversation type of usage, and how we look at each other through race, religion, creed. Like, that's really the identifying factor, rather than what they think or what they want to say.
Right. I mean, it's just that. I mean, it's who you are. If you're not singing the party line, so to speak, and if you're not supporting the Soviets, the communist ideology going forward in that era, you were a target. I mean, they set out to eliminate a class of people. And what really worries me today, when I see, organizations or groups who define people by the group, and because you belong to that group, you're an oppressor or you're the oppressed, that harkens back to the same thing this guy was talking about. And we know where that went. Millions of people dead. And, a society that is just, they become so cowed and so terrified of being the next victim that they do exactly what the violence was intended to do, stop them from saying what they thought. Now, the violence that we're experiencing today is more job related or socially related. So you're going to lose a job. You could, kind of a worst case, definitely going to lose friends over it. You're going to be kind of ostracized, kicked off social media platforms if they don't agree with how you talk about things. So that's your political leanings.
Yeah, and I think it's important what you said. It's an elimination of an entire class, right? So even if it's not, active genocide for now or anything like that right now, what was happening during these times was, in effect, genocide. They were going after a very specific group of people. Now, obviously, it wasn't based on like their genetic predisposition or their race or ethnicity. Sometimes it was, but other times it was like they were still targeting a very specific group of people, and they were eliminating them from society. And so, like you're saying today, it's not incredibly violent yet. We're not there yet, but there's still an active attempt to eliminate voices from society and to make sure certain ones are not heard over others.
Right, exactly, and that's what they were excellent at doing. That they would remove that person from the environment, either by execution in the worst case, or send them into the prison system, the gulag system, where, at the worst of it, during the Stalin era, 1 in every 20 people in the Soviet Union was arrested, 1 of 20. And, one point, almost 2 million people were sent to the Gulag system, during Stalin's, some of the worst period of his time, where they worked to death, starved, or even executed there. And again, just separating those people, anybody who could be a threat to the society, their society, the communist society, was fair game.
Yeah. Another tactic that I think is really important to talk about. So we've talked about how language is used against us, how they want to change language with technology, using modern technology to tamp down on free speech and expression. But there's also, well, there's 2 more I want to talk on. The first one is the censorship of art and culture. And so when we're looking at, things that we're supposed to aspire to, which is art is supposed to create that like inspiration in us. It creates that cultural, that intellectual curiosity in us. And it makes us really want to go honestly towards more the divine, which is where a lot of art is around. And so what is this battle against art and culture that communist regimes had historically, and why was that there? But then what are we seeing today, and like kind of how does that square up?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think if you look back in history, I mean, it was amazing how into the weeds the communist parties got into the arts, the literature, et cetera, and film. I mean, so Lenin, in a famous letter to Maxim Gorky, one of the most famous authors of his time, called this guy and said, basically the paraphrase was that I'm really worried about you because you're talking about this group of people that's against the communist regime, and I'm really concerned for your safety. So you think about that. You got the guy in charge of the country who's clearly demonstrated a willingness to kill about anybody to stay in power, sends you a personal letter telling you to tamp it down, bud, or something bad's going to happen. And Stalin, same thing. He would call directors, playwrights, authors, and make sure that either he was portrayed in a very good light, or the Communist Party writ large was, dictating what was permissible and what was not. I think a lot of it today is, I think a lot of artists self-censor. I think a lot of them don't say what they want to, what they believe in some cases. I think the ones who do, you've heard a lot of actors talking or complaining about, well, I'm a conservative, so I'm not getting any job offers anymore, or I'm not going to make this film because it could cause some issue. I just read an article. I forgot the guy's name, but it was about this guy who played in the band Mumford and Son. And he had to leave the band because he didn't feel he agreed with some of the things that was going on with the work he was trying to do and the things he wanted to say. So I think it's sad. I mean, it really is. The art, again, it should be a place you can escape from, all the politics that we hear all the time, but it's in the arts, it's in sports where I love watching football, but every time I turn it on, there's some slogan, somebody's doing something. I mean, again, free speech, you're welcome to it, but I mean, political, I mean, why do we have to do that during a football game? Why can't I just want to watch the game? Or if I want to go to a concert, I don't want to hear politically correct, songs or whatever, or something that somebody, either the Academy itself now, or whoever is telling me that this is good enough. This is what you should hear. You don't need to hear anything that, we don't agree with. And we limit the artists who go that way. And
I think the goal then is to essentially just brainwash us into a certain type of culture. Like the more you hear it, the more you're exposed to these ideas, the more likely you're just going to like follow suit and, think that this is normal. They're normalizing every like progressive idea or woke idea that they have, specifically to get everyone to fall in line and say, this is the new normal now. You can't escape it. And this is the culture that you're going to embrace. You can't escape that either. So like tearing down statues, changing history, all of this is like kind of goes back into the cultural push that they're trying to create.
Yeah, and don't forget, again, all the stuff that we're talking about has been done before. Maybe the technology was
exactly. Yeah.
So, Stalin was famous for photoshopping guys out of pictures that, he was in with them. There's several famous pictures just like that where this guy was out of favor, or he executed them, or he is rewriting history to make this guy, a terrible person, human being, because he ran afoul of Stalin's paranoia. And, we seem to be, allowing ourselves that same type of thing to happen to us. We're not really, fighting for our side of what we believe is correct.
Yeah, and as you mentioned the playwrights and the musicians in those times. But there's also, all of, like we mentioned, like the religious art that was all taken down, it was all removed. Anything having to do with the czars or royalty, everything was removed. You couldn't find it anywhere. And so like, I think, yeah, and you mentioned how like they tried to influence plays because they didn't want the art to go away because that would be too obvious. It had to be subtle that the art still existed in its own way, but it was censored and it was changed and altered in the liking of kind of whoever was in charge.
Right. And I think you make a good point too about the religious aspect of it. So they take control of the religious aspect of society. They want to eliminate it, number one. If you look at what Lenin did when he took over and the Bolsheviks came into power, they literally just robbed and pillaged the Russian Orthodox Church across the country, mainly to finance their government. That was what most people don't understand. They stole, I forgot what the numbers are. Sean McMeekin in his book, The Russian Revolution, really lays it out really well. But he talks about just the hundreds and hundreds of pounds of gold they stole out of the churches, silver, tons of silver and the like. And then when the priests and the bishops of the country started resisting it, they killed them. About 1,200 priests were murdered, 20,000 parishioners who tried to stand up against this theft and taking of those religious artifacts was, they were murdered. And, it's just that if there's a religious aspect to society, then that's something that people can escape to,
right,
and think about something besides the party, who is really, that's the religion. Communism is, it's got an answer for every problem. And the answer typically is something to do with the state or something to do with a party. They'll fix it. Or if they can't fix it, they'll tell you it's fixed and lie to you and say it's okay. You must be a defeatist. What's wrong with you?
That is a fantastic point to hammer home, though, is that the Communist Party, the level of power that they sought was to replace God in the household, was to be the religion of the state. And that was kind of what because if there is a power beyond you, then all of a sudden everything else in the party breaks down, because you're supposed to, like you said, have the answers for everything as the state. That's the only way you can get people to kind of sign up for it.
Yeah. I think their kind of philosophy was, when the religious people, Christians, they believe in, for example, that, you live a life, you have God to focus on, and when you die, you go to paradise, go to eternity. What the communists promised everybody was paradise on earth without God. Right. That's what their promise was, and they never delivered. What they delivered was death, misery, repression, just in poverty everywhere it's been tried.
Yeah, and one of the other tactics I want to touch on before we wrap up is something that you're working on directly, which is the attempts to target the youth, right? Like how significant are younger generations to these, or how key are they to totalitarian regimes and to their success? Why do we see right now in society a targeting of K through 12 and higher education, just going after the institutions of education? What's the objective behind this?
Well, I think when you grab somebody at a younger age and you can train them to think a certain way when they're receiving a certain message, then as they get older, it's kind of locked in, right? They're already to the point where they believe the lie. So there's another good quote. So the ideal subject for totalitarian rule is not so much the convinced communist, right? But it's the people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e., reality and experience, and the distinction between true and false no longer exist. So if you can fill them full of these ideas where they believe the lie, 2 + 2 is 5. Yeah. Then later on, as things, progressively more important ideas come into the main, then it's easy to convince them to follow along.
And I think any parent would know too that kids believe anything. I mean, I'm not a parent. I have had younger siblings though, like when they'll believe anything you tell them. And so it's easy to kind of build that imagination towards reality. And
it's driving a wedge between, parents and
that's an excellent point.
And their students. I think, one of all the things that we see happening in the schools, I think of all the COVID mess that we've had, Probably the only benefit that we got out of that whole mess has been the fact that parents were home and they actually saw what some of their students were being taught. And it
Yeah.
scared them for the right reasons. You know, when you're hearing some of the things that some of the, I'll just call it what it is, it's garbage. It's either no history or incredibly slanted, or it's a simple ideology. They're just trying to pump this stuff into a kid's head to make them think the way the teacher thinks. And that's not right. They should be teaching them, you know, giving them an education, a proper education, where they can read, they can write, critically think about things. You know, don't give them an answer you want them to spout. You know, let them think about things and, you know, develop their own thoughts and ideas about it. I think ideas for those people become dangerous.
Definitely. And I think you made an excellent point in that parents are finally starting to kind of open their eyes to it. I think we, especially 80s and 90s and early 2000s, we were becoming very dependent on the public education system, just because it started, you know, it started with your traditional subjects as English, math, science, and literature. But then all of a sudden now it's like they're adding sexual education, you know, throughout the decades over. They're adding, you know, different, like, let's teach your kids about drugs, basically to the point where we're going to teach our kids all the things they should probably be learning at home, and the parents should probably be teaching them, but we'll just take that on because we know you guys are busy and you're all working, and then, you know, you don't need to handle that. So it just kind of came up over the decades, but now we're starting to see the insidious nature of all of that, and kind of like what the ultimate goals was to manipulate the youth and to use them against society.
Right. I think that's an excellent point. I think it's, again, you know, I'm talking now with a lot of parents who are going to these school board meetings. They're having these, you know, pretty frank discussions with the school board about what they're seeing, you know, in the kids' homework. I think it's really just brought the parents back to a much greater extent than they have been for many, many years, back into the education of their children. And it's very important to do that and be aware, because a lot of teachers out there are really good, and they're working hard. They're trying to make a difference in a kid's life. And I think that's admirable, but, you know, some aren't. I mean, it's just like anything else in society. There's going to be some that are bad apples, and you really got to watch it. And because your kids that's a precious resource. And if you get them focused the wrong direction right away, it's going to be very, very difficult to get them back. Yeah,
absolutely. I kind of want to end on some of the stuff you saw, because I know you were, you know, in the military, you got to see a lot on the ground as it was happening, like the fight for freedom and what was going on there. So I'm kind of curious, what was the fight for freedom like under these types of regimes?
Well, I mean, I tell you, I really admire these people. I mean, to such a degree. Now, I tell people in the Army, you know, it's when I've been to combat, had people shoot at me, try to kill me. And it's a terrible experience. I mean, I wouldn't wish that on anyone, but, you know, I had the ability to shoot back.
Yeah.
I could dictate the terms of the fight if I prepared myself. These people, especially you think about Eastern Europeans in the Soviet era and the Chinese folks today, they don't have that luxury. They don't get to shoot back. They're out there unarmed against the police state who has demonstrated the willingness to kill people to stay in power. So it's a horrific fight. We've got a lot of friends, and you know, my background, I'll tell you up front, is Soviet era, Russia, and that part of the world, Eastern Europe. That's where, you know, I spent all my time working. Don't know as much about, you know, China. I'm trying to get smarter on it because it's a huge threat. But, you know, these people, you know, endure a lot to win their freedom, and some people pay their lives for it. I mean, there's a great my first assignment in Germany. There's a place near one of the border outposts that we manned on the West German side, and it's a road up this mountain, and up this mountain there's 14 crosses, and in each one of those crosses, this is in West Germany at the time, is where a group of about 3 families were murdered by the East Germans, who, when the West Germans broke across the fence, they followed them and killed every one of them in West Germany. So they risked their lives trying to seek a better life in the West. So that's the level of commitment they had. And I think what is very sad is our students today in, you know, middle school, high school, they get none of that. They don't understand that, you know, this idea of socialism or idea of communism that's gaining a little bit of traction, and a little, you know, a complete neglect of teaching history in a lot of cases has left people open to the idea and romanticize these isms, which is very dangerous, because there was nothing good if it's so bad that, you got to come across a border fence and murder 14 people to what?
Right.
What was the end there? Just other than just violence for violence sake.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's something that is definitely taken for granted. As you mentioned, just how serious the whole situation was, because again, we do talk about it as if it's very, as I mentioned in my opening, it was just kind of, we remember it, we remember, like we have memorials and kind of days where we dedicate to these experiences under communist regimes, fighting for freedom, but we don't actually think to ourselves like, wait, what actually was going down in these, this is what the school system should be teaching, is kind of remembering kind of what specifically was happening and how hard it was to get to where we are today in a free society, because that's not something that comes easily. We've mentioned that a lot of times when societies drift towards socialism, communism, or other types of totalitarian leadership, they drift that way because of complacency. A bunch of, when you have citizens who are either genuinely disinterested and preoccupied with other things going on in their life, and there's no real drive there, or they forget kind of where they came from and what we have that's special, or there's just like those folks who you mentioned before, self-censor, who are okay with wrong, this concept of wrongthink or double speak, where they're just going, they don't, it's easier to keep your head down or to just spout the, what the social justice warriors want you to say, just to avoid any confrontation. But mediocrity, I mean, that's not, if you're not choosing a side, then you're relinquishing the other side that you're not choosing. So it's like, if you're not choosing freedom, then you're relinquishing to the other side, which is going to try to destroy freedom. So I think these are really, really important lessons for students, and some of the work that you're doing is just really, really awesome and admirable because of what you guys are working on, trying to educate the younger students to just understand this history in a much more serious manner, and not just be like, oh, it's just Stalin, it's something that's used as a term to describe mass murder, but something more serious than that. So from you, any final thoughts on how to remind people that their freedom should be more valued and not taken for granted?
Yeah, I just think it's, I would suggest that people, go on our website. We have this thing called the Witness Project. It's a series of videos for people who actually lived under these communist regimes and were able to escape. And for anybody who has the notion that this is, this is a cool system, or you're sporting your Che Guevara t-shirt because you think he's cool and not realizing he's a mass murderer,
right.
I would say, go listen to these people, go to our website. There's a lot of facts and information, educational material to get smart on what this thing called communism is really all about and the cost. So remember, over 100 million people dead to in place to either secure or maintain a communist government. 100 million, 1.5 billion still living under communist rule in the 5 remaining nations, China, Vietnam, et cetera. It's a horrible system, and people are suffering still today through this system. So go to our website. There's, obviously, we're a nonprofit, so we appreciate you see that little red donate button. Anything you'd like to give to help us out to, kind of work on our educational programs to spread the word about this. And also, we have a speakers bureau. So if you're, in university level, high school, middle school, or you're a teacher or you're a parent, you want somebody, one of our experts to come talk to you, or one of our witnesses to come talk to your school or your university, we are always willing to come do that. So please reach out and let us know.
That's a great feature, getting the witnesses or some of your experts to talk to these groups and these, like, kind of, especially in elementary school or middle school, where it's really going to resonate with students and kind of at that younger age, just kind of opening their eyes at an earlier time for that, and high school as well, actually, too. Yeah.
And we got some very powerful speakers who can just really really tell you that the true story about how wonderful this system called communism really was.
Right. Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. So this is Well Said. I interview policy experts, commentators, academics, students, and activists on topics in higher education, free speech, and other related topics in American culture and policy. You can share this episode on your Facebook or YouTube page, as well as our podcast on either Apple, Spotify, Anchor. We have all the podcast apps. So download that and listen anytime. Give us a 5-star rating if you like what you heard today. I'm Cherise Trump, and Ken, that was Well Said.
Thank you.